What does it take for a man to change? And when he does, who decides if he deserves a second chance? Can someone who broke the community's trust ever truly earn it back? In a small riverside town where everyone knows your name and remembers your shame, one man returned carrying a burden heavier than the chains he'd left behind. The mistake that sent him away. The walls that kept him locked in. And the invisible prison waiting when he came home. The stakes. More than forgiveness. More than acceptance. Sometimes proving you've changed means risking everything, including your life. This isn't just a story about redemption. It's a story about whether a broken man can become whole again when the world refuses to forget. Before the hero nobody saw coming, there was Marcus. Welcome to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every truth demands to be heard. Now, before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Is it morning in Accra, evening in Nairobi, or midnight in Johannesburg? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because stories like this remind us why grace matters. Now, lean in. Because this is about the ex-convict nobody trusted who became the hero the community needed. The bus rattled into Riverside just after dawn, kicking up red dust that settled on everything like guilt. Marcus stepped off with nothing but a worn duffel bag and eyes that had learned not to meet anyone's gaze. 5 years ago, he'd left this town in handcuffs. Now he was back, and the silence that greeted him felt louder than any accusation. Mrs. Adeyemi, sweeping her shop entrance, saw him first. Her broom stopped mid-stroke. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just turned and walked inside, shutting the door a little too firmly. Marcus adjusted the bag on his shoulder and kept walking. Home was 3 miles down a road that suddenly felt longer than any prison corridor he'd walked. His mother's house sat at the edge of town, paint peeling, garden overgrown. She stood on the porch waiting, hands folded over her chest like she'd been standing there for 5 years. When Marcus reached the gate, she didn't rush to him. She just looked at him, really looked, the way only a mother can, seeing both the boy she raised and the man who disappointed her. "You hungry?" she finally asked. Not "welcome home." Not "I missed you." Just "you hungry?" Marcus nodded, throat too tight for words. Inside, the house smelled like memory, fried plantains and old wood and the soap his mother used on everything. Photos still lined the walls, but his face had been turned backward in most frames. His younger sister Grace smiled out from her graduation picture, the one taken 2 months after his arrest. He hadn't been there. He'd missed everything. That afternoon, Marcus walked to the community center where Mr. Okonkwo had once promised him a job. "If you ever get yourself straight," the old man had said, "come see me." Marcus remembered those words through every cold prison morning. Now he stood at the center's door, heart hammering, hope sitting fragile in his chest. Mr. Okonkwo looked up from his desk, recognition flashing across his face followed by something harder. "Marcus," he said slowly. "Heard you were back." Marcus straightened his shoulders, tried to sound confident. "Yes, sir. I came about that job you mentioned. I'm ready to work. I've changed." The silence stretched between them like a test. Mr. Okonkwo's jaw tightened. "That position was filled 3 years ago." "I'm sorry." The words landed soft but cut deep. Marcus saw it then, in the man's eyes, in his carefully neutral expression, the truth that would follow him everywhere. Nobody was waiting for his redemption. Walking back through town, Marcus felt every stare, every whispered conversation that stopped when he passed. At the market, mothers pulled their children closer. At the mechanic shop, his old friend Thomas looked right through him like he was glass. The robbery had been stupid, desperate and stupid. He'd been young, broke, drowning in debt from his father's medical bills. He'd made one terrible choice and it had cost him everything. But he'd paid his debt. Served his time. Sat through every rehabilitation program, every counseling session, every moment of forced reflection until he genuinely changed. He wasn't that scared, foolish boy anymore. But how do you prove that to people who only see your worst moment? How do you show them the man you've become when they are still looking at the monster you were? That night, Marcus sat on his mother's porch watching the sun sink behind the hills, painting the sky orange and purple like a bruise healing backward. His mother brought him tea, set it down without a word, started to leave. "Mama," he said quietly. She stopped, back still turned. "I know I hurt you. I know I shamed this family. But I'm going to make it right. Somehow." She stood there for a long moment, the cicadas singing in the darkness, before she finally spoke. "Making it right and being trusted again, those are two different things, Marcus. One takes time. The other." She turned, and he saw tears tracking down her weathered face. "The other might take a miracle." She went inside, leaving him alone with the truth that cut deeper than any prison wall. He was free, but he wasn't forgiven. And maybe, in this town that remembered everything, he never would be. 3 weeks of rejection had taught Marcus to keep his head down and his expectations lower. He found work doing odd jobs, fixing roofs, hauling trash, anything people would pay cash for without asking questions. The money was small but honest, and honest was all he had left to offer. He'd walk home each evening past the community center, past the school, past all the places that used to be his until one mistake made them belong to everyone else. Grace called sometimes, brief conversations where she was kind but distant, successful but careful not to let him too far back into her life. "I'm proud you're trying," she'd say, which somehow felt worse than if she'd just been angry. He didn't want her pride. He wanted his sister back. Then the rains came early that year, fierce and relentless, turning roads to rivers and the river to rage. The riverside community, named for the water that fed their crops and filled their wells, suddenly found itself at the mercy of that same water rising fast and angry. By the third day, the warnings came through crackling radios and shouted messages passed door to door: "Evacuate the low-lying areas, the dam upstream was failing." Marcus watched families loading trucks and cars with whatever they could carry, panic spreading like fever through the streets. Mrs. Adeyemi struggled with boxes, her shop, her life's work, sitting in the flood zone. People helped each other, but no one looked at Marcus. Not for help. Not for anything. The elementary school sat closest to the river, and someone realized too late that 15 children were still inside the after-school program, forgotten in the chaos. Marcus heard the screams first, then saw parents running toward the building as water already lapped at its foundation. The current was strong, getting stronger, and the bridge that led to the school was beginning to buckle. Fire Chief Williams tried to organize a rescue, but the water was rising too fast, and his team was scattered across town helping with evacuations. Marcus stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, watching terror paint itself across faces he'd known his whole life. Watching Thomas, his old friend who wouldn't speak to him, collapse to his knees because his daughter was in that building. Watching Mrs. Adeyemi clutch her chest, crying that her grandson was trapped inside. Something shifted in Marcus then, not a decision, more like a remembering. He thought about the boy he'd been before everything fell apart, the one who'd jumped in the river to save a drowning dog, who'd carried old Mr. Kwame's groceries every Saturday without being asked. That boy was still in there, buried under shame and isolation but not dead. Not gone. Before anyone could stop him, before he could think about the water's violence or his own fear, Marcus was running. He hit the river at full sprint, the current slamming into him like a fist, trying to drag him under. People shouted behind him, warnings, curses, he couldn't tell which. The water was cold and cruel, filled with debris that cut at his skin. But he'd learned something in prison about swimming through impossible things, about keeping your head up when everything's trying to pull you down. He reached the school's front steps as water poured through the doors. Inside, children huddled on desks and tables, some crying, some silent with terror, their teacher Miss Gloria trying to keep them calm with a voice that shook despite her brave words. "We are going to play a game," she was saying. "Who can be the bravest?" Marcus appeared in the doorway like something conjured from prayer, water streaming off him, breathing hard. Miss Gloria's eyes went wide. She recognized him. Everyone in this town recognized him. For a second, he saw the doubt flash across her face. Can we trust him? But then the building shuddered, floodwater surging higher, and there was no time for doubt. Only choice. "I can get them out," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "But we have to go now." Miss Gloria looked at the children, at Marcus, at the water climbing the walls. Then she nodded. "Okay. Help us." Marcus moved fast, calm in the chaos the way he'd learned to be when everything's falling apart. The older kids first, he could carry one on his back, guide two more holding his arms, fighting against current that wanted to claim them all. Thomas met him at the bridge, terror transforming to desperate hope as he pulled his daughter from Marcus's arms, holding her so tight she gasped. "Go back," Thomas choked out. "Please go back." And Marcus did, again and again, his muscles screaming, lungs burning, the river trying to kill him with every crossing. Other men joined once they saw it could be done, Fire Chief Williams, Mr. Okonkwo, even young Samoa from the mechanic shop. But Marcus led them, his prison-built strength and something fiercer than strength carrying him through. The last child was small, maybe 6, too frightened to move. Miss Gloria wouldn't leave without her, so Marcus took them both, the little girl clinging to his neck, the teacher's hand gripped in his. Halfway across, his foot hit something under the water and he stumbled. For one horrible moment they went under, the current ripping at them, trying to separate them. Marcus felt the girl's grip loosening, felt the river winning. Then hands grabbed him, Thomas on one side, Mr. Okonkwo on the other, pulling them up, pulling them forward, pulling them home. They collapsed on the bank in a tangle of coughing and crying and grateful breathing. The little girl was screaming for her mother. Miss Gloria was praying out loud. And Marcus just lay there in the mud, every part of him hurting, every part of him alive. What happened next, Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Thomas helped him to his feet, looked him straight in the eyes, really looked at him, the way no one had since he'd come home, and said 2 words, "Thank you." Then Thomas did something that made Marcus's throat close up with emotion. He pulled him into a fierce hug, clapping his back the way they used to when they were boys, brothers in everything but blood. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered. "I'm sorry I turned away." Around them, the crowd had grown, people who'd watched Marcus risk everything without hesitation, watched him become the answer to their prayers. Mrs. Adeyemi pushed through, tears streaming down her face, her grandson safe in her arms. She touched Marcus's shoulder, gentle, grateful. "Bless you," she said. "Bless you." The dam didn't break, and eventually the waters receded, leaving Riverside bruised but breathing. In the days that followed, something shifted in the town's air. People started to see Marcus differently, not because he'd explained himself or argued for his redemption, but because when it mattered most, he'd shown them who he really was. Mr. Okonkwo came to him with a job offer, a real one this time, managing the youth program at the community center. "Those kids need someone who understands that mistakes don't define you," he said. "Someone who knows what it takes to become better." Marcus accepted with shaking hands and a full heart. The work was hard but good, helping troubled teenagers find their way, seeing pieces of his younger self in their angry eyes and offering them what no one had offered him, a second chance before the first mistake. Months later, on a Sunday morning bright with hope, the community gathered for a celebration, not of the flood survivor, but of the courage that had saved them. They named Marcus Riverside's guardian, and though he tried to refuse the title, said he'd only done what anyone would do, they wouldn't let him hide anymore. His mother stood beside him, hand clasped tight in his, tears of pride replacing years of disappointment. Grace came home for the ceremony, hugged him long and real, whispered, "I've got my brother back." As Marcus looked out at faces that had once turned away but now smiled at him with genuine warmth, he understood something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about writing a new story so true and brave that it became bigger than the old one. The ex-convict they'd feared had become the hero they needed, not because he'd stopped being the man who made mistakes, but because he'd become the man who rose above them. Marcus didn't just come home. He came back to life. What he gained wasn't their trust, though that came eventually. What he earned was something deeper, the knowledge that who you become matters more than who you were. The lesson: redemption isn't given. It's proven. Not through words or apologies, but through actions that speak louder than any past mistake. Sometimes the hero nobody trusts becomes the one everyone needs. If this story moved you, hit that like button and drop a comment about second chances. Do you believe people can truly change? Share this with someone who needs to hear that their past doesn't have to be their future. And subscribe to Stories by the King, because we're here to remind you that every ending can be a new beginning. This is Stories by the King, where every story reveals the hero hidden in the ordinary.